The O'Malley clan rules Western Ireland with a fierce stronghold in both land and sea. The chieftain's daughter, Grace O'Malley, was drawn to the ocean.
Where Grace O'Malley is concerned, the sea is in her DNA.
Defying the conventions of her era, she rose to become a feared captain and clan ruler, dominating Irish waters for 50 war-torn years as an infamous pirate and respected leader of men.
She was a force to be reckoned with.
In a period of time when women did not have power.
Her battles took O'Malley from the Highlands of Scotland to the heat of Spain and the court of Queen Elizabeth I. She carved her mark on history and legend and will forever be known as Ireland's Pirate Queen.
The 16th century Ireland is not a nation. There is no sense of Ireland as a whole. You have all of these clans that rule their small territories.
This was a very different system to having a singular kingdom. There was a lot of moving parts in terms of the politics of any given region.
An extensive domain in Western Ireland and the waters beyond has been claimed by the O'Malleys.
The O'Malley clan are associated with the sea even before written history of Ireland. In the old legends of Ireland, if you mention an O'Malley, it is always to do with the sea. One of the medieval poets of the time called them the Lions of the Green Sea.
Deirdre O'Malley is the head of the clan and a fearless sailor. His fierce reputation, strength and resilience earns him the nickname Black Oak O'Malley.
Being a maritime clan, plundering and piracy was part and parcel of seafaring at that period and indeed long before it. The richest fishing grounds in Ireland happened to be off the west coast of Ireland, which was O'Malley territory.
So they are able to basically tax those who want to sail in their water. They have enough power that they go, this is our water, you want to traverse it, please pay us.
One example, for instance, is in 1553. King Philip II of Spain paid £1,000 a year for 21 years to ensure that his Spanish fleets could use the waters around the coast of Ireland for fishing. Grace O'Malley was born around the year 1530, and she was actually the daughter of the O'Malley chieftain.
The wild Irish sea courses through young Grace's blood, and yet her desire for the waves remains forbidden. Boats are no place for girls. A female presence on board supposedly inviting bad luck and worse weather. To a superstitious clan, O'Malley's place was at home and not at sea beside her father.
And we have to recognize by the age of 7, a young girl would be starting to take on the responsibilities of becoming a female in a society that is very patriarchal. Definitely if she was older, she would be starting to think about, potentially getting married and running her own house. But Grace wanted to go to sea.
According to legend, Grace is warned that life at sea is too dangerous for women. Her long hair a hazard among sheets and sails. She hacks it off in defiance, earning herself a moniker, Grace the Bald.
You have this young girl whose father agrees to take her to sea, to instruct her, as he didn't do his son who lived nearby. So we have to look and see, why is this? And we will have to come to the conclusion that the daughter made the better seaman. And you had to know what you were doing. It's a very, very dangerous coastline all along the west coast of Ireland, still is today, still has its many tragedies every year.
Grace swiftly proves her worth as a sailor, absorbing everything her father teaches. Soon after, she joins him on voyages of trade and piracy in the Irish seas and beyond.
There's a lot of really strong currents there, which means they have very easy access to go all the way down to areas like Spain and France, but it also allows them to go along the northern part of Ireland and trade with Scotland. And we know that the O'Malleys had gallowglasses.
Gallowglasses are fierce Scottish mercenaries, employed by the Irish to fight battles between clans. These soldiers for hire held no political interest in the conflict, engaging in warfare for money.
Part of what allowed the O'Malleys to be strong was that they had not only the access to these waterways, but they had the knowledge of these seas. And that's part of what makes them so very strong.
Grace O'Malley is now a trusted sailor in her father's fleet, but she remains more valuable to him in other ways. Duadra informs his daughter that she's to leave the sea behind and is soon to be married.
Her marriage would have been arranged for her and had to pay political, social, and monetary gain to both her family and to her clan. The O'Flahertys and the O'Malleys occasionally came to blows, and it was really to try and cover over this animosity that had grown between two neighbouring tribes that Grace O'Malley's marriage was made with the son of the chieftain of the O'Flahertys.
Upholding ancient tradition and her father's wishes, O'Malley marries Donal O'Flaherty, marking a fresh chapter as she settles into family life.
She had two sons with Donal O'Flaherty and a daughter, so she became a full-time mother from about the age of 17 to around her early 20s. But also, as the wife of a chieftain, she has to look after him.
Donal, O'Malley's husband, is doggedly ambitious, but also dangerously reckless. Waging war on neighbouring clans, he fosters ugly feuds with powerful enemies. Donal's miscalculated attacks lead to distrust in his decision-making, placing his leadership at risk.
The O'Flaherty men start to recognize that Grace is really more the leader.
She very much capitalised on that Celtic religious approach where women were equal to men.
Before long, Donal's exploits catch up with him. Overwhelmed and outmatched, he's cut down by a rival clan whilst fighting for ownership of a fortress, Cox Castle, leaving O'Malley a widow.
And when his body was returned to Grace O'Malley, she mourned her husband, she buried her husband, and this is where she goes on her first act of revenge. Because she takes his clan and goes and takes back the castle that he had lost and died for.
O'Malley destroys her enemies, fighting in her husband's memory. Cox Castle is now hers, and in honour of her victory is renamed Hens Castle.
And it is the name it still bears today and is still visible today. Very rarely do women lead on a battlefield, and this is the first time we see Grace O'Malley doing that.
Despite having avenged her husband's death, the O'Flaherty elders refuse her and her 3 fatherless children a home or financial support, leaving her empty-handed.
And she was literally forced to come back to her father's chieftaincy in Clubay in County Mayo.
Another death throws Gracie's future into question, the passing of her father, Duadra, leaving the O'Malley clan leaderless. Spotting a rare opportunity, Grace seizes the mantle of clan chief. Long-standing tradition dictates that only men can become chieftains, but Grace cares little for such conventions, and nor do the men who loyally flock to her side.
She's supposed to have settled on one of her father's castles on the beautiful Clare Island. And it is there she set herself up as a chieftain. Whether they were attracted to her by her possibilities as a seafarer or her charisma, men from other clans, they agreed to come. And over the years, she put together an army of 200 men who followed her wherever she ordered. This is where, I suppose, the pirate queen of the Grace O'Malley story comes into play. She followed the business that was in her DNA. She started toll-taking on the ships that used the port of Galway. So she made them pay tolls for safe passage through what she considered O'Malley territory.
Grace O'Malley is not targeting treasure ships. She's not bringing back gold and silver and precious jewels. She's targeting small cargo ships. It could be cloth, potentially wine. It could be various foodstuffs. Doesn't matter whether you're an English ship, a Spanish ship, or even an Irish ship. You are considered fair game because it is about family and clan.
There are many references to her plundering. For example, down in Thomond in County Limerick, she's found there. She's also found up in Donegal at this time, taking cattle mainly from the clans who would have been neighbouring the sea all along the west coast of Ireland. And in Ireland at the time, there was no such thing as currency. Everything was based on the price of literally a cow. So to have as many cattle in your possession, that was your wealth. And Grace O'Malley admits herself to having almost 1,000 head of cattle and horses.
As Grace O'Malley and her clan raid further and increase in power, frightening rumours of her piracy reach English shores.
The English have been involved in Irish politics since the 12th century. But by the time we're getting to the 16th century, this is a period of nation building for countries like England and Spain and France. And England recognizes that if they cannot control Ireland as a whole, that she would become a threat. Spain could use it as a jumping off point, a launching point to attack the English. And they are seeking to bring Ireland fully under English control. And the challenge is there is no one king of Ireland to capture. You have all of these different clan leaders.
Queen Elizabeth I rules over England in her father's shadow. Henry VIII had established a foothold in Dublin as part of his campaign to conquer Ireland. Elizabeth needs to expand her territories, peacefully if possible, but by force if necessary. The English have control over Dublin. Now their gaze shifts west.
The conquest of Ireland now takes on a new urgency. Henry VIII tried to seduce the Gaelic chieftains to adopt English law, English custom and English titles. Some of the bigger chieftains actually did take on English titles and in theory became English subjects. The O'Malleys did not do that.
In the context of Grace O'Malley, this meant that in the world that she lived in, with the clan system, she could hold a position of authority and indeed be a ruler. In a world where English authority was extended into Ireland, it would be very tough for her to hold a position of, shall we say, government authority, or she would be subordinated to an authority.
And it is during these traumatic periods for the latter half of the 16th century that Grace O'Malley has to operate within that scenario.
The English catch wind of Grace O'Malley and her clan, but are powerless to stop her. Not only does she bear unrivaled knowledge of the Irish Sea, but there's a versatile fleet of ships and seasoned sailors at her disposal.
One entry in the state paper says there are no other galleys in Ireland like these.
On the tomb of Grace O'Malley, there's a representation of a galley, which looks like a substantial vessel.
The galley was an extraordinary vessel. It had adapted over time to the lateen sail, the triangular sail, which made it much more versatile on the sea. The old Viking square mast could only sail with the wind, whereas the galley with its lateen sail could manoeuvre against contrary winds. It also had a very shallow draft, which meant that it could come very close to the shore, which for Grace O'Malley and her trade by sea was very, very important.
Throughout the archives, including in this period, basically reference anything from 3 to 20 galleys. Even 3 would be pretty significant. 20 would be a small navy, if we're thinking about it. By having these galleys, she has the ability to really cover a broad amount of territory. She could travel potentially all the way down to Spain. She has the sail power and the manpower to do this.
At the same time, she was looking beyond her territorial waters to gain greater control and greater power.
As the English slowly extend their control from Dublin, Grace O'Malley seeks to expand her own domain in Western Ireland.
This is an interesting period because this is when we see the pragmatic side of Grace O'Malley coming out. She wants to claim full control of Clew Bay. At this point, there is only one castle that she does not control, and it's at kind of an important junction within the waterways there, and that's Rockfleet Castle.
Hidden away with a fantastically sound anchorage for her ships. The owner of this castle is called Richard in Iron Burke. He was quite a powerful chieftain in Mayo at the time and was next in line to succeed to the overall chieftaincy of all of Mayo.
And so she makes the very political, pragmatic decision of, let's get married. And so this was seen as a meeting of two very powerful leaders.
Grace enters into this marriage of convenience with one ambition: to take control of Rockfleet Castle. In Irish law, both husband and wife have the legal right to end their union after 1 year.
The stories go that after a year and a day, Grace O'Malley basically closed the gates of Rockfleet Castle and said, I divorce thee, but I'm keeping the castle. And so this leads to total control of Clew Bay.
Grace places Burke's shoes outside the castle gate in an accepted sign of divorce, banishing her former husband from his own castle. Grace O'Malley takes command of Burke's troops to defend what is now her domain. This bloodless coup further solidifies her control of Ireland's western coast.
She was playing a really clever political game. She was trying to expand her area on the water while also trying to expand her connections and her influence on land. And it all was to the betterment of her surviving as a Gaelic ruler at a time when the world around her was changing.
Rival clans and Queen Elizabeth I are closing in on O'Malley's territories, forcing the pirate queen to reunite with her husband she abandoned to strengthen her clan. Soon, O'Malley falls pregnant with her fourth child.
It is said that she was out at sea pirating when they got into a battle with Algerian pirates.
Legends say O'Malley gave birth to her son Tibbet at sea, only shortly before their ship is besieged by Algerian pirates. The fearsome captain drawing her weapon and rushing the deck in defence of her crew.
The pirates were taken aback by this dishevelled appearance and hearing the child cry in the background that they for a moment were taken off their guard.
So she goes onto the decks to rally them and defeat these pirates. And this becomes the story of this woman who just can do it all. It really demonstrates why the English are going to fear her so.
The legend of Grace O'Malley spreads like wildfire. Her reputation as a cunning pirate and fierce warrior, earning her mentions in official correspondence between Queen Elizabeth and her army in Dublin.
One dispatch says the most notorious woman in all the coasts of Ireland. Another dispatch calls her a chief director of thieves and murderers at sea. Another calls her a nurse to all rebellions in Ireland. So this identikit of this strange woman is being built up at the Elizabethan court. And it is amazing to read all these descriptions about her in the English state papers.
By the 1570s, we're seeing more and more pressure being put on the English to not just claim on a map Ireland, but to fully have Ireland under English law, English control.
Rather than seizing land by force, Queen Elizabeth plans to offer titles to Irish chiefs in exchange for their loyalty under a policy labelled Surrender and Regrant.
Many of them handed over their lands to the Crown in agreement that they showed fealty to Queen Elizabeth, and in turn, by doing so, they were allowed to keep their lands.
O'Malley and her husband embrace Surrender and Regrant, pledging their loyalty to Queen Elizabeth in order to become Lord and Lady Burke. As a subject of the Crown bound by English law, Grace vows to end her career of piracy. Satisfied with her pledge of allegiance, the English return to Dublin, trusting that this will be the last they hear of Grace O'Malley.
Not long after she pledged herself to the English administration, she sailed immediately south and started plundering lands further down the west coast of Ireland in violation with her agreement. So in effect, she'd gone back on her pledge almost right away.
In defiance of the English law designed to bind her, O'Malley continues to plunder ships and demand tolls.
Again, we know that she went across to Scotland and raided places there in her ships and raided ships belonging to the Scottish lords. So she did undertake, I suppose, direct acts of piracy.
Grace O'Malley really used coastal raiding and intercepting shipping as a form of warfare. So in other cases, if somebody had double-crossed her, or if she felt the need to get ahead of a political situation, then she would raid towns. So she would move into a region, go into that town, plunder what they had in the port, and move on, perhaps take hostages. So it had a political purpose as well.
As we're getting into the latter part of the 16th century, England is identifying itself with this idea of being an island nation. And as an island nation, they need to control the seas around them. Grace O'Malley is the figurehead of all of the rebellions that are going on, just simply the successes that her men and her vessels are having in impacting English trade, English authority. By getting rid of her, the English would be able to conquer and claim leadership, authority, and power in this area.
There is now a target on O'Malley's back, the English in hot pursuit of the pirate queen. A long, tireless search by Elizabeth's men leads to the eventual capture of the clan leader.
Those captured with her were put to death, so it was inevitable that she too would have thought that perhaps this is how she was going to end her time.
Held in the gloomy dungeons of Dublin Castle, O'Malley awaits her fate.
Only the highest political prisoners were placed in Dublin Castle by the English, and Grace O'Malley was considered one of these.
There was no real communications. There was no way of finding out what was happening back home, as it were. You know, you didn't have a proper bed to sleep in. These were harsh conditions. They were unforgiving conditions. So it must have been a horrendous time for Grace O'Malley.
Meanwhile, on the west coast of Ireland, an uprising led by O'Malley's husband, Lord Richard Burke, threatens the dominance of the English in Clew Bay.
He had set up a rebellion in Mayo to hope to be able to get her out.
Almost 2 years of O'Malley's life have been spent in a prison cell. But now, her captors agree to release the pirate if she swears to return home to Rockfleet Castle and convince her husband to stand down his aggression against the English. Over a decade has passed. Ireland's landscape dramatically altered by an English crown insistent on tightening its grip over the country. And Lord Burke dies, making O'Malley a widow for the second time. It doesn't take long for the pirate queen to rebel, snatching back her promise to the English and taking to the open sea, targeting any ship unfortunate enough to sail nearby.
She is taking on an ever-growing myth for the English as instigating and inciting the Irish in this area, and potentially the fear that one small area would have a domino effect and could then incite others to rebel against English authority.
The Crown appoints Sir Richard Bingham as the Governor of Connaught, a lifelong soldier with a well-earned reputation for cruelty. He's determined to tame the rebellious pirate queen at last.
He is very much about bringing the Irish under complete and utter control by any means necessary.
Where Grace O'Malley was concerned, he took an instant dislike to her, and he set out to really undermine her power.
Very bluntly, Bingham is not a fan of the Irish to begin with, so she becomes the devil incarnate, I guess we could almost say, of what makes Ireland so uncontrollable. And so he is actively going to target her.
Bingham's army rampages across the countryside in a scorched earth campaign designed to starve the Irish rebels into submission. His troops march on the O'Malley stronghold of Clew Bay.
Now, Grace O'Malley led 3 rebellions against the very, very cruel rule of Sir Richard Bingham, and 3 times he backed off. However, he got at Grace O'Malley the way that one would get at a mother, and that was by imprisoning her family. He first had her eldest son, Eoin O'Flaherty, killed, and Grace O'Malley talks as a mother how she counted 24 wounds on the dead body of her eldest son. Her second son by Donald O'Flaherty was called Murroch na Muir O'Flaherty, and when he decided to align with Bingham, the vengeance of the mother knew no stop. She gets into her galleys, attacks her son's castle, and took some of his property to teach that son a lesson that he was not to side with her enemy. Bingham got to Grace O'Malley through the third son, Tibbet, born aboard her ship at sea and saved from the Algerian pirates.
Tibbet is arrested and imprisoned on charges of treason.
Grace O'Malley knows that Tibbet's life is at stake. Treason was punishable by death. And this is really what motivates her to try and get directly to Queen Elizabeth I. For somebody with a litany of misdeeds registered against her in the English court, it was absolutely, one would imagine, impossible, but not to Grace O'Malley.
Desperate to save her son's life, O'Malley attempts the impossible, requesting an audience with the Queen of England. Using her political connections, she sends a petition to Elizabeth, demanding the release of her son, Tibbet.
At the National Archives, we have a petition issued on behalf of Grace O'Malley to Elizabeth I. And in the petition, she really outlines and speaks to the difficulties of being a ruler in Ireland in that period, and really just how she's had to advance her interests just to stay afloat.
Grace is creating an image of a powerful woman, but also indicating her loyalty to the crown, while saying, I've also struggled because of your English administrators. They've not taken me seriously, they've not given me my due, even though I'm a loyal subject.
I think this is a very clever petition in many ways, because it's being addressed to Elizabeth I, who is somebody who probably feels relatively similar, that she's had to really fight for her position, she's had to really advocate for herself in a very politically difficult climate, but particularly also as a female ruler.
Queen Elizabeth accepts O'Malley's request and grants her an invite to London.
So Grace O'Malley, a known pirate, a known rebel at this stage, had now a complete control of her passage to England because she had her letter of introduction to the English court. So in June 1593, to save the life of her son, Grace O'Malley set out on the most important voyage of her long and eventful career.
Queen Elizabeth agrees to an audience with O'Malley, meeting the infamous pirate and violent rebel at Greenwich Palace. These two formidable women, who against all odds, have risen to become rulers of their people. Stories escape the palace of tension building as O'Malley refuses to bow to a queen she sees not as a representative of God, but as her equal.
Grace O'Malley had taken this trip from Western Ireland all the way to London. She'd come up the Thames. It's cold, it's clammy. She had a bit of a cold. One of Elizabeth's courtiers offered her a handkerchief, and so she blew her nose and then threw the handkerchief into the fire. all of the English were appalled because from their viewpoint, she had burnt a valuable piece of cloth. It indicates kind of the social differences.
The legends continue. The Queen's guards discover a hidden dagger on O'Malley. But Elizabeth accepts the pirate's assurance that the weapon is strictly for self-protection. Tensions subside as the two leaders begin to talk.
Queen Elizabeth was looked on as the Queen of England, the leader of her army. She never led an army in the field of battle. She was looked on as mistress of the oceans. She never sailed further downriver than Greenwich. And here you had this woman who had done all the things that Elizabeth was prohibited or unable to do. And both women were of a similar age. They were in their 60s. So you had two experienced elderly women coming together to exchange views, and one hoping to get her son released.
What is perhaps surprising is that the petition seems to have been completely successful. I don't exactly think it was common for a ruler from County Mayo to get on a ship and sail to meet the Queen of England herself, much less be granted an audience and get what she wanted.
O'Malley secures the release of her son and confronts her old adversary, Bingham. But he refuses to believe that this ill-famed Irish rebel could be granted such a favour from his queen.
Richard Bingham very much thinks that the Queen has been hoodwinked, that she could not possibly have fallen for whatever lies that Grace O'Malley had said. And he actually refuses to enforce it initially. So there's definitely a questioning of authority there. And the Crown very clearly says, this is our will, which as far as he sees means that she is going to be able to continue thieving on the high seas. It is definitely, without a doubt, a victory for Grace O'Malley, and it's seen as having basically bypassed Richard Bingham, which ultimately is not going to make their relationship any easier as you go forward.
Bingham took his revenge out on Grace O'Malley, and any time her ship left shore, he put on 20 English soldiers on her ships, so she couldn't really pursue what she normally did, a little bit of piracy and plundering as well as her trading. That was prohibited by Bingham. So in a way, Bingham did get some revenge on Grace O'Malley.
Bingham continues to place troops on Grace O'Malley's ships. He also forces her men to operate in service of the English, sometimes against their own kinsmen. Under constant supervision and unable to plunder or take tolls from passing ships, the O'Malley clan is forced to retreat inland.
Ireland is not the world that Grace O'Malley had been born into. It is coming more completely under the authority of the English crown, and it is no longer being done through a peaceful process such as surrender and regrant. We're seeing the English military might being brought to Ireland. And so the force of English authority is very much at the end of a sword at this point.
So the only thing that mattered to Grace O'Malley was to be able to survive within this new structure that was being forced upon them.
O'Malley can only see one way out. To save her family from the tyrannical campaign of the English, she must give up her fight, handing over control of her army to Tibbot and agreeing to hold County Mayo in the name of the Crown.
Grace O'Malley is a survivor, and that's an important element here. She has survived all of the changing politics up until this point, and we see this coming into play at the Battle of Kinsale, which is seen as the last great battle between Gaelic leadership and English leadership. And the question of, will they be able to overthrow English authority?
Now, two chieftains in Ulster at the time decided to put behind them centuries of intertribal warfare between both their families to try and unite all the clans of Ireland.
1601, the English seized control of vast swathes of Ireland, and at the Battle of Kinsale, the remaining clans unite against their common enemy in what would be the last stand for Gaelic Ireland. Grace O'Malley dispatches Tibbet and their armies to join the battle. The Gaelic chieftains hope the O'Malleys will arrive as allies to fight alongside their countrymen against the crushing might of the English army.
Tibbet brings the O'Malleys to it, and the stories go that he stood on the hill and he kind of watched the battle and went, which way is it going to go? All of the Gaelic lords are excited. The O'Malleys have come. They will help turn the tide. Except he comes in on the side of the English army.
And with 3,000 other royalist Irish, he decided to fight on the side of the English in order to preserve his own patrimony and his own future.
These are the final years of Grace O'Malley. Her long career as a ruthless pirate, now a distant memory. Her once ferocious reputation, no longer deemed a threat to the English.
The Gaelic world, it petered out, so Grace O'Malley did, and I think it's right that we really don't know how she died. It is said she is buried on Clare Island, and indeed there's a lovely tomb there that is said to be her final resting place.
1603, Queen Elizabeth dies. And in the same year, so does Grace O'Malley. After a reign lasting nearly half a century, she leaves in her wake a clan every bit as resilient as she was, enduring the pounding onslaught of the English Empire, and against the sea of trouble, always finding ways to prosper.
All of the seafaring and all of the piracy and toll-taking died with Grace O'Malley.
If you look at the English archival records, she is going to continue to be mentioned for almost 25 more years. English administrators are basically saying if it wasn't for Grace O'Malley, Western Ireland would have been less problematic.
Her career spanned at least 40 years. In the golden age of the Caribbean, 18 months was looked upon as a successful career for a pirate. Grace O'Malley died in old age, still as a ruler. So she was extremely successful as a leader, as a pirate, as a Gaelic lord. In a way, she carried out to the letter the motto of the O'Malley clan, which is maintenance by land and by sea.
She goes from simply being a historical figure to being part of living memory, and she becomes a symbol of hope and ultimately of survival.